The air in the hallway of Anthony Romano's office, in the heart of Boston, was thick, charged with a tension that cut the breath short. Emma, his personal assistant, was backing away, her eyes wide with terror, as Derek Sullivan, a high-ranking executive in the organization, cornered her against the cold wall. Derek's voice, once a sickeningly seductive whisper, was now a possessive growl, his hands advancing with repulsive boldness. Emma tried to wriggle free, her screams muffled by the hand covering her mouth. Despair painted across her face as he drew closer, his hot, foul breath on her neck. She felt panic rising in her throat, the paralyzing fear that no one would hear her, that no one would come, that this nightmare would become a brutal and irreversible reality. Her tear-filled eyes scanned the hallway for any salvation, any sign that Anthony's office door would open. But hope faded with every second as Derek pressed her harder against the wall, his repulsive body glued to hers. I am Rose Cameron, and today you will hear a story of power, protection, and a love that was born in the most unlikely circumstances. If you enjoy intense narratives about human nature and redemption, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share. The story of Anthony and Emma proves that even in the darkest moments, hope still finds a way. To understand the depth of that moment in the hallway, we need to go back in time, to the beginning of it all, to Anthony Romano's rise and Emma's arrival in his life. Anthony Romano was not an ordinary Mafia boss. He had inherited the empire from his father at the age of 28, an empire built on the blood and sweat of generations, but he, with his sharp intelligence and ruthless business vision, was transforming it into something more sophisticated, more discreet, yet no less lethal. His organization, though still rooted in ancient traditions, operated with the efficiency of a modern corporation, with legitimate investments and a network of influence that stretched across Boston and beyond. Anthony was respected and feared, a man of few words but firm decisions and inevitable consequences. He ruled with silent authority, his eyes observing everything, his mind always 3 steps ahead. Emma Miller, on the other hand, was a force of nature in her own right, though in a completely different way. She joined Anthony's organization through a recruitment program for exceptional administrative talent, having no idea of the true nature of the business she was about to enter. With a degree in finance and an impeccable work ethic, Emma quickly stood out. She was organized, efficient, and possessed a keen intuition for details that many others overlooked. Anthony, who valued competence above all else, noticed her. He promoted her to his personal assistant in record time, entrusting her with tasks of increasing importance, from managing his complex schedule to organizing confidential documents that, if they fell into the wrong hands, could destabilize his entire empire. Emma, initially intimidated by the aura of power and mystery surrounding Anthony, soon learned to admire his intelligence and leadership ability, even though the exact nature of his operations remained a veiled enigma. The dynamic between Anthony and Emma was strictly professional, but charged with a subtle tension, an electric current that both felt but never openly acknowledged. Anthony was demanding but fair, and Emma responded with loyalty and dedication that went beyond what was expected. She became indispensable, the only person who could anticipate his needs before he even expressed them. He, in turn, began to trust her in a way he had never trusted anyone outside his innermost circle. There was something about Emma's calm and competent presence that brought a strange sense of order to the controlled chaos of his life. She was a safe harbor amid the constant storm that was Anthony's world, and he, without realizing it, began to depend on her more than he cared to admit. It was in this environment of professional respect and unspoken attraction that Derek Sullivan entered the scene. Derek was a longtime executive in the organization, a man who had climbed the hierarchy through a combination of cunning and questionable loyalty. He was charming on the surface, with an easy smile and a gift of gab that fooled many. But beneath the polished facade, Derek was a predator, a man who saw women as objects to be conquered and discarded. He had a history of inappropriate behavior, but his usefulness to the organization and his ability to generate profits had always shielded him from the most severe consequences. Anthony, though aware of Derek's reputation, tolerated him for his effectiveness in business, keeping him at arm's length and under surveillance. When Emma began working more closely with Anthony, Derek noticed her. Her beauty, her intelligence, and her proximity to the boss made her an irresistible target. At first, it was just lingering stares, complimentary comments that made Emma feel uncomfortable, but that she tried to ignore, attributing them to corporate culture or her own sensitivity. But the comments became more frequent, more suggestive, and the stares turned into accidental touches that lasted a little too long. Emma began to feel a shiver of revulsion every time Derek approached, a sense that something was terribly wrong, but she didn't know how to react. She feared the repercussions of reporting such a powerful executive, especially in an organization where the rules were different, where hierarchy was sacred and a man like Derek's word carried weight. The harassment escalated insidiously. Derek began finding excuses to be alone with Emma, to discuss reports or review projects at late hours when the office was emptier. He would corner her in secluded spots, whisper obscenities in her ear, and make veiled threats about her career if she dared tell anyone. With each incident, Emma felt her confidence drain away, her joy in her work diminish, replaced by constant anxiety and growing fear. She tried to dodge him, make excuses, but Derek was persistent, relentless, and the feeling of helplessness consumed her. She began avoiding empty hallways, eating lunch at her desk, leaving the office as quickly as possible. But Derek always found a way to get close, to remind her of his power over her. With each day, the shadow of fear grew denser, and Emma felt increasingly trapped in a web of terror and silence. The pressure became unbearable. Emma began having nightmares, losing sleep, feeling constantly watched. She tried to hide it, to maintain her composure at work, but Anthony, with his keen perception, noticed the changes. He saw the pallor in her face, the way she avoided eye contact, the slight flinch when Derek passed nearby. Anthony was a man who read between the lines, who understood the unspoken language of fear and intimidation. He began watching Derek more closely, noticing how the executive lingered near Emma's desk, the forced smiles he directed at her. A dark suspicion began to form in his mind, an intuition that something was very wrong, and that Emma was suffering in silence. He had no concrete proof, only the uncomfortable feeling that one of his wolves was hunting within his own pack, and that was something Anthony Romano would never allow. That fateful day, before the confrontation in the hallway, Emma had spent the entire morning trying to avoid Derek. She had locked herself in her office, made excuses not to leave, but he was waiting. He intercepted her when she finally had to go to the filing room and followed her closely, his comments becoming more aggressive, his threats more explicit. Emma felt her heart pounding, adrenaline coursing through her veins as she tried to stay calm, trying to find an escape. She knew she was in danger, that Derek had crossed a line from which there was no return. The fear that he might do something even worse, something that would mark her forever, was overwhelming. She just wanted it to end, for someone to save her from the nightmare that was becoming more real by the minute. The moment Anthony intervened was a turning point. After Derek was brutally beaten and taken to a private hospital run by the organization, Anthony knelt beside Emma, who was still in shock, trembling uncontrollably. He helped her to her feet, his eyes locked on hers, conveying a silent promise of protection. "You're safe now, Emma," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. "He will never touch you again. No one will." In that instant, Emma felt a wave of relief so intense that her legs buckled, and she would have fallen if Anthony hadn't caught her. He carried her to his office, sat her in a comfortable armchair, and called a trusted family doctor to examine her. He asked no questions, did not pressure her. He simply ensured she was safe and cared for. That gesture, the way he protected her without hesitation or doubt, began to break down the barriers she had built around her heart. In the days that followed, Anthony kept his promise. Derek Sullivan was summarily expelled from the organization, not just fired, but completely erased, his reputation destroyed, his contacts severed. He became a pariah, a living lesson to anyone who dared cross the boundaries set by Anthony Romano. Emma, for her part, received discreet but constant protection. Anthony assigned one of his most trusted men to ensure her safety, and he personally oversaw her well-being. He encouraged her to take time to recover, to process the trauma, and assured her that her job would be waiting for her, with all her responsibilities intact. With each day, Emma's gratitude toward Anthony grew, transforming into something deeper, something she couldn't name. She saw in him not just the ruthless boss, but a protector, a man of principles, even if his methods were brutal. Gradually, Emma began to heal. She returned to work, and Anthony's presence was a silent comfort. He treated her with even greater respect, a gentleness he rarely showed anyone else. They spent hours together in the office, discussing business but also sharing moments of comfortable silence, of glances that said more than words. Anthony began to open up to her, revealing a side few knew: his passion for Boston's history, his love for Italian cuisine, the complexity of his life and the pressures of his role. Emma, in turn, felt comfortable sharing her own dreams and fears, her aspirations and vulnerabilities. The line between boss and assistant began to blur, replaced by a genuine connection, a friendship that deepened with each day. The attraction between them was undeniable, a magnetic force pulling them toward each other. Anthony, who had always kept his emotions under strict control, found himself thinking about Emma constantly, worried about her well-being, craving her company. He caught himself smiling more, laughing at her jokes, feeling a warmth in his chest he had never experienced before. Emma, for her part, saw Anthony in a new light. The man who had saved her was complex, yes, dangerous perhaps, but also incredibly loyal, protective, and, in a surprising way, gentle. She felt safe beside him, a safety that went beyond the physical, an emotional safety that made her want to be near him, to feel his touch, to hear his voice. Anthony's world, once a dark mystery, now seemed like a place where she could find her own place, beside him. One night, after a long day at work, they were alone in the office. The city of Boston glittered outside, lights reflecting off the windows. Anthony was reviewing documents, and Emma was organizing his desk. The silence was filled with the unspoken energy between them. Anthony looked up from the papers and found her watching him. A soft, almost imperceptible smile appeared on his lips. "Emma," he said, his voice low, I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't arrived in time." Emma felt a shiver. "I know, Anthony. I'll never be able to thank you enough." He stood, walked over to her, and reached out, gently touching her face. The touch was electric, a spark that ignited a flame. Their eyes met, and in that moment, all barriers fell. The kiss was hesitant at first, then passionate, an explosion of repressed emotions, gratitude, desire, and a connection forged in the fire of danger and protection. It was the beginning of something new, something that would change their lives forever. Their relationship blossomed in secret, away from the prying eyes of the organization. Anthony and Emma met in discreet places, dined in out-of-the-way restaurants, and spent nights talking, laughing, and getting to know each other on a deeper level. Anthony discovered Emma's passion for art and literature, her sharp intelligence, and her ironic sense of humor. Emma, in turn, saw Anthony's more human side, the man who cared for his family, who had an unbreakable code of honor, and who, despite his hard exterior, was capable of deep love and loyalty. They became each other's safe harbor, the refuge where they could be themselves without the masks the world demanded. With each day, the love between them grew, a silent but powerful force that bound them in a way neither had ever imagined possible. Despite the happiness they found in each other, the shadow of the past still lingered. Derek Sullivan, though banished and humiliated, had not disappeared completely. He was a wounded man, and a wounded man, especially one with Derek's inflated ego, was dangerous. Anthony knew this. He had placed his best men to monitor Derek, to ensure he posed no threat. But Derek's hatred and thirst for revenge were deeper than Anthony had anticipated. Derek had lost everything: his position, his reputation, his power. And he blamed Emma and, above all, Anthony for his fall. He vowed to make Anthony pay, and that Emma would be the instrument of his revenge. With each passing day, Derek became more obsessed, more determined to prove he still had power, even if it was only the power to destroy. Anthony and Emma's life, though filled with love, was also a constant dance with danger. Anthony was a mafia boss, and his world was inherently violent. Emma, by becoming involved with him, had entered that world and knew the consequences could be terrible. But she was willing to accept the risks, because the love she felt for Anthony was stronger than any fear. They planned a future together, a future where they could build a normal life away from the shadows, but they knew it would require sacrifices and constant vigilance. Anthony, for his part, was determined to protect Emma at all costs, to ensure she never suffered at anyone's hands again. He had found in her not just a lover, but a partner, a soulmate, and the idea of losing her was unbearable. The calm before the storm was deceptive. Derek, operating from the shadows, had spent months planning his revenge. He had hidden, rebuilt himself, and was now ready to strike. He knew Anthony's weakness was Emma, and that to hurt the boss, he needed to hurt the woman he loved. He studied Emma's routine, her habits, her vulnerabilities. He waited for the perfect moment, a moment when Anthony's guard was down, when Emma was alone and unprotected. Derek's patience was the patience of a predator, and his plan was as cruel as it was meticulous. He wanted Anthony to feel the same pain, the same helplessness he had felt, and for Emma to be the final sacrifice on his altar of revenge. The day of the attack arrived abruptly and brutally. Emma was leaving the office late at night after finishing an urgent report. She was distracted, thinking about Anthony, about their weekend plans. As she approached her car in the underground parking garage, a strong hand covered her mouth, and a cloth with a sweet-smelling substance was pressed against her nose. She struggled, but the chemical acted quickly, and her senses began to fail. The last thing she saw before darkness swallowed her was Derek Sullivan's distorted face, a sadistic smile on his lips. Panic flooded her, an icy terror that made her fight against unconsciousness. But it was too late. She was dragged into a dark car, and the world became a blur of fear and darkness. Anthony felt a chill down his spine when Emma didn't answer his call. He knew she was still at the office, and her lack of response was unusual. A sense of dread gripped him, a dark premonition he had learned to trust. He called his men, demanding an immediate check. Within minutes, the news came. Emma's car was in the parking garage, but she had vanished. The security cameras had been disabled. Anthony felt the blood freeze in his veins. Derek. It could only be him. The fury that had consumed him in the hallway months ago was now an uncontrollable blaze, a flame threatening to consume everything in its path. He mobilized all his resources, all his men, to find Emma. He would not rest, would not stop, until she was safe in his arms again. Derek took Emma to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Boston, a decrepit and isolated place perfect for his dark purposes. When she woke, she was tied to a chair, her mouth gagged, her body aching, and her mind in panic. Derek stood before her, his eyes gleaming with vengeful madness. He began spewing threats, describing what he would do to her, how he would use her to destroy Anthony. Emma felt terror take hold, tears streaming down her face as she struggled against the ropes, despair growing with every word from Derek. She knew she was in grave danger, that Derek had no limits, and that her only hope was that Anthony would find her in time. Meanwhile, Anthony was in a race against time. He used every contact, every source, to track Derek. With each clue, each piece of information, Anthony's fury grew, fueled by the fear that he might be too late. He did not stop, did not sleep. His mind focused on one goal: rescue Emma. His men worked tirelessly, scouring every corner of Boston, every known hideout of Derek's. The entire city seemed on alert, sensing the tension and relentless determination of the Mafia boss. Anthony knew Derek was a desperate man, and desperate men were the most dangerous. He had to find them before Derek could carry out his macabre plans. The final clue came from a reluctant informant, one of Derek's former underlings who had been discarded. He revealed the location of the abandoned warehouse, a place Derek used for his dirtiest dealings. Anthony did not hesitate. He gathered his most loyal men, armed himself, and sped off, his heart pounding, a mix of fear and cold determination. He knew the confrontation would be brutal, that Derek would not surrender easily. But Anthony was ready. He would do anything to save Emma, to protect her from the monster who had terrorized her. The image of Emma, terrified and helpless, drove him, the promise that he would save her echoing in his mind. Upon arriving at the warehouse, Anthony and his men surrounded the site. He entered alone, gun in hand, his eyes scanning the darkness for Emma. The smell of mold and decay filled the air. He heard a muffled whimper from a corner, and his heart raced. There she was, tied up, eyes wide with terror, and Derek, with an insane grin, holding a knife. "Well, well, Anthony Romano," Derek mocked, his voice dripping with hatred. "You arrived just in time for the show." Anthony did not respond. His eyes were fixed on Emma, conveying a silent promise that everything would be all right. He knew there was no time for negotiation, only action. The confrontation was savage and brutal. Derek, driven by madness and desperation, lunged at Anthony with the knife, but Anthony was faster, better trained, more lethal. The two men clashed, the sounds of blows and grunts echoing through the warehouse. Anthony disarmed Derek with a swift move, and the knife clattered to the floor. The fight became hand-to-hand, a visceral battle of raw strength and hatred. Anthony delivered precise blows, each one charged with months of pent-up worry and the terror of seeing Emma in danger again. Derek fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal, but he was no match for Anthony's relentless determination. Anthony finally pinned him against a stack of crates, his eyes burning with deadly intensity. "You will never touch her again," Anthony growled, his voice low and dangerous. Derek tried one last surge of defiance, but Anthony was merciless. With a quick, decisive motion, he snapped Derek's neck. The executive's body slumped lifeless to the floor, the sound of his death echoing in the silence that followed. Anthony stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, body tense, before turning to Emma. He rushed to her, untied her, and pulled her into a tight embrace. Emma sobbed, tears of relief and terror mingling as she clung to him, finally feeling safe. In the days that followed, Anthony and Emma recovered from the trauma. Derek Sullivan's death was handled as a disappearance. Another body the Boston underworld swallowed without a trace. Anthony ensured Emma received all the support she needed, both physical and emotional. He was by her side every step of the way, his constant presence a balm for her wounded soul. The experience brought them even closer, solidifying the love that had grown between them. They had faced hell together and emerged stronger, more connected than ever. Anthony realized Emma was not just the woman he loved, but the woman who completed him, who brought light to his dark world. One night, as they dined at his favorite Italian restaurant, Anthony looked at Emma, his eyes filled with a tenderness he rarely showed. He took her hand, their fingers intertwined. "Emma?" he began, his voice slightly hoarse. "I know my life is complicated, that my world is dangerous. But you brought something into my life I never thought I'd find." You saved me in a way I never imagined possible. Emma looked at him, her eyes shining with tears. Anthony, you saved me. More than once. He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that melted her heart. I want to save you every day, for the rest of my life. Anthony pulled a small velvet box from the inner pocket of his jacket. Emma's heart raced. He knelt right there, in the middle of the restaurant, ignoring the curious glances. Emma Miller, he said, opening the box to reveal a stunning diamond ring. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of building a life with me? Of giving me a family? Of being the light that guides my path? Tears streamed down Emma's face. She couldn't speak, only nodded vigorously, a radiant smile on her lips. Yes, Anthony. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Anthony stood, slipped the ring onto her finger, and kissed her passionately, sealing their promise of eternal love. Anthony and Emma's wedding was a discreet but joyful celebration. They married in a small church in Boston, surrounded by their closest friends and Anthony's family. Emma, in her white dress, looked radiant, and Anthony, in his impeccable suit, had never looked happier. That day marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one where love and hope prevailed over the shadows of the past. Anthony, with Emma by his side, began making significant changes in his organization, seeking to further legitimize his businesses, moving away from the darkest practices, driven by the desire to build a safe and honorable future for his wife and the family they hoped to have. The years passed, and Anthony and Emma built a life together, one filled with love, respect, and companionship. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, who brought even more joy and purpose to their lives. Anthony became a devoted father, a loving husband, and a leader who, though still feared, was also respected for his justice and unwavering loyalty. Emma, for her part, flourished beside him, becoming a strong and confident woman who found her voice and her place in the world. She continued working in the organization, but now as a partner, a trusted advisor to Anthony, her intelligence and intuition invaluable assets. The story of Anthony and Emma is proof that love can arise in the most unexpected places, that protection can come from the most unlikely hands, and that redemption is always possible, even for those who live in the shadows. They faced harassment, violence, and darkness, but emerged stronger, bound by an unbreakable bond. Their love was not a fairy tale, but a real story of overcoming, sacrifice, and the indomitable strength of the human spirit. Anthony Romano, the Mafia boss of Boston, found his redemption and purpose in the eyes of Emma Miller, the woman he protected and loved above all else. And Emma, in turn, found in Anthony not just a protector, but the love of her life, the man who saved her and helped her flourish. Together, they built a legacy of love and hope, proving that even in the darkest world, light always finds a way.